methods were perhaps illegal, he dismissed them with a remark that revealed not only his personal philosophy, but the growing sentiment of ambitious military men everywhere. Won't you stop citing laws to us who have swords by our sides? And remember, a generation later, this was the man who defended the Republic against Caesar. Clearly, the rule of law was not long for this particular world. Having subdued Sicily, Pompey sailed next for Africa, where he defeated the scattered remnants of Sulla's enemies. For this last act, Pompey decided that he deserved a triumph. Where he got the idea that he deserved one is a mystery for the ages. Not only was he not old enough, he had not yet reached the minimum office required, praetor, to be considered for this greatest military honor, and in fact, had not even served in any public office at all. Finally, it had been a long-standing tradition that a triumph could not be approved if the battle or battles in question were against fellow Romans, which is, of course, what Pompey's African campaign was all about. It is from this impetuousness that Sulla hung the sarcastic title of Magnus on Pompey. Ah, yes, Pompey the Great wants a triumph. Let's all bow before Pompey the Great. But Pompey was undeterred. He refused to disband his army until his request was granted. Sulla, partly to appease his wife and stepdaughter, who had married Pompey the year before, and partly out of a genuine fear of what Pompey may be capable of, approved the triumph. But Pompey would have to wait. First, Sulla held his own triumph, marching through the city to great fanfare and with much splendor. Next, Metellus Pius was granted his triumph, and the senior general marched through in similar splendor, but with slightly less fanfare. By the time Pompey's triumph rolled around, the city showed little enthusiasm for the event. What, another triumph? Boring. Sulla hoped he had put young Pompey in his place. But Sulla died before he realized that nothing would ever put Pompey in his place. It was not long after Sulla's death that the first in a long line of would-be despots arose in his wake. A consul named Lepidus decided after his term was complete that he was not ready to give up the reins of power, and gathered an army in northern Italy to support his bid for a second term. Lepidus himself arrived in Rome with a great train of supporters, claiming that he controlled the land between the Po River and the Alps, and that his second consulship had better be approved, or else. The Senate had already sent Metellus Pius to Spain, where the last great Marian general, Quintus Sertorius, continued to hold out. So they sent young Pompey north to quell the brewing insurrection. It did not take long to scatter Lepidus's supposed army and send word to the city that it had nothing to fear. Lepidus, who fancied himself the next Sulla, was forced to flee from the city, never to return. After ending this threat from Lepidus, Pompey issued a demand to the Senate that was even more insane than his request for a triumph. He wrote that he wanted to be sent to Spain as proconsul with full imperium. Again, Pompey had never served in office a day in his life, and was yet 15 years away from being eligible for a consulship, let alone a proconsulship, which was reserved for men who had already, served as consul. Pompey knew it was brash, but he also knew as well as the Senate did the situation on the ground in Spain. Metellus Pius, as great a general as he was, had been thus far unable to gain ground on the rogue Quintus Sertorius. It was clear that Pius needed help, and that Pompey was heads and shoulders better than anyone else Rome could possibly send as a reinforcement. With great reluctance, they approved Pompey's request and made him proconsul of Spain in 76 BC, at the tender age of 30. Crassus was, of course, appalled. Pompey remained in Spain for the next 5 years, engaged in a parallel rather than combined war effort alongside Metellus. Neither general had any wish to share the glory should one of them actually succeed in defeating the rebellious Sertorius, though neither had much to worry about as the Marian general ran circles around them both. Pompey began to tire of the cat-and-mouse game in Spain, and instead began to covet a command in the east, where Mithridates was once again making trouble for Rome. But extracting himself from Spain would not be so easy after the fuss he had made to get there in the first place. Besides, he had rivals back home that desired the eastern command for themselves, and were doing everything in their power to make sure Pompey remained in Iberia, chasing his tail. But fortune smiled on Pompey once again, and in 71 BC, Sertorius was assassinated by an ambitious lieutenant who then took command of the rogue army for himself. But this lieutenant was not half the commander Sertorius had been, and in his first encounter with Pompey was defeated easily. Just like that, Pompey had liberated Spain. After lucking into this victory, Pompey took his army back to Italy just in time to luck into some more glory, scooping up for himself a good deal of undeserved credit for ending the slave revolt that had erupted in his absence. And of course, the credit he scooped up came at the expense of Crassus, who had done the yeoman's work in defeating the slave army led by a certain Thracian gladiator. Next week, we'll cover this famous slave revolt, led of course by Spartacus, who at one point stood at the head of 120,000 men and won multiple victories against the pride of the Roman legions. In the aftermath of the revolt, Pompey and Crassus would forge an uneasy alliance while some 5,000 captured slaves were crucified up and down the Appian Way, a lesson to those who would follow in Spartacus' footsteps. Finally, I would like to add that I've made a few changes behind the scenes here at the History of Rome. I've abandoned Blogger, which turned out to be the cause behind all the early episodes not showing up on iTunes, to a new blog at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com. Don't even get me started on what's wrong with WordPress. Also, at the prodding of some generous listeners, I've added a never expected to gain anything financially from the History of Rome, but a few of you out there have expressed an interest in sending a few appreciative dollars my way for the effort. So, if you find yourself so inclined, there it is. Any amount you choose, Visa and MasterCard accepted, minus whatever the leg breakers at PayPal take as their cut. Thanks to all of you out there who have stuck with the show, and see you next week for Spartacus. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 36, I Am Spartacus. Last week, we traced the early career paths of Crassus and Pompey, leaving them both on the edge of political prominence. This week, we will cover the event that broke them into the big time. Prior to the Third Servile War, Crassus was just another fat cat, and Pompey was just another ambitious young man on the make. But after the slave revolt, both turned their well-deserved and not-so-well-deserved acclaim into a shared consulship. Acclaim, and the fact that both refused to stand down their armies until the Senate agreed to make sure the elections produced the result that was in everyone's best interest. In 73 BC, Pompey was in Spain trying to pin down the rebellious Marian general Quintus Sertorius, and Crassus was in Rome doing whatever it was that Crassus did, probably dickering with a drowning man over the price of tossing him a lifeline. Spartacus, though, was at gladiator school in Capua. He was supposed to be learning how to put on a good show for his Roman masters, but mostly he was plotting his escape. Kirk Douglas was born in New York in 1916 to illiterate Russian immigrants. His real name was Isur Danilowicz, but he spent his early years answering to the name of Izzy Dembski. He began acting in high school and knew from the moment he first stepped out on stage that he wanted to be an actor. Oh, wait a second. I think I may have mixed things up a bit. Hang on. Okay, I got it. No one is quite sure where Spartacus the Gladiator came from. It seems pretty clear that he was born somewhere in Greece, and he is most often referred to as a Thracian. But Thracian was also the gladiatorial combat style he practiced, so there may have been some confusion somewhere along the line about his true origins. It is also not known how he came to be in captivity, but he was widely believed to have served as an auxiliary soldier in the legions at some point, and he may have been a captured deserter. However it happened, it did not take long for the traitors to recognize that he would make a promising gladiator. Peter Ustinov purchased Spartacus and brought him to Capua to train for life in the arena at a gladiatorial school. In 73 BC, a plot was hatched at the school that eventually included some 200 gladiators and slaves to break out of captivity. However, with that many people involved, it was just a matter of time before someone talked. When the conspirators were confronted, after the inevitable squealer squealed, they decided to just go for it, and with whatever crude weapons they could grab, mostly kitchen utensils, about 70 fought their way out of the school. Initially, the escape mob had no leader, but a few in the group possessed the kind of natural authority men turn to in a crisis. One of these was, of course, Spartacus, but another, of equal standing at this point, was a Gaul named Crixus. The escapees showed more confidence and daring than one might expect from men on the run. They proceeded to raid the countryside around Capua, which, as you may recall from earlier episodes, was some of the richest, most fertile land in Italy. The majority of the Roman elites had country estates in the region. And of course, where there are palatial country estates, there are slaves, none of whom were too excited about their status. So, when the escaped gladiators showed up at the door demanding plunder, master's slaves did not defend master's things. Master's slaves joined up and helped carry off whatever they could. Pretty soon, the band had grown into the thousands. Displaying the kind of sound judgment and strategic thinking that would make them such a formidable force, the group headed towards Mount Vesuvius, where they set up a stable camp on the densely wooded slopes. At first, the Senate looked upon the raiding as little more than common thievery and took no official notice. They did not realize that Spartacus and his compatriots were building an army. They did not realize that the Third Servile War had already begun. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourself, Third Servile War? What about the first two? So let's back up a bit. The First and Second Servile Wars were both contained to Sicily, and I mentioned the former in passing during the episode on Tiberius Gracchus when I was ticking off some of the reasons grain prices in Rome were skyrocketing at the time. That war lasted from 135 to 132 BC, and was the result of the barbaric treatment shown to the island's slave population after Rome took full control of the island in the aftermath of the Punic Wars. The Second Servile War broke out a generation later, while Marius recruited for his showdown with the Cimbri in 104 BC. After some local provincial rulers across the empire complained that they were unable to supply their recruit quotas because all of their ablest recruits, read, poor young men, had been chained up and sold into slavery by overzealous Roman debt collectors. So Marius ordered the release of any slave from an allied nation. This was great as far as it went, but in Sicily, many slaves took this to mean that they were free, and were quite displeased when they were ordered to return to their masters. So a force of about 25,000 formed a coherent army and broke out into open revolt. Both slave uprisings were eventually quelled, but only after great effort and expense. So the Roman Senate, despite having previously witnessed 2 slave revolts, did not yet recognize what was happening in Campania was in fact another slave revolt. They dispatched an irregular militia of about 3,000, led by one of that year's praetors, Gaius Claudius Glauber, down to round up the fugitives and put a halt to the looting. Glauber located the slave hideout on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius and settled into a camp at the base of the mountain. Everyone knew there was only one safe way to come down Vesuvius, because the back end of the mountain was all cliffs. The slaves would eventually get hungry, develop them, and Glauber would be welcomed home a hero. QED. Except that the slave army had no time for conventional wisdom or standard military practice. During the night, they used vines from the trees